Hello Calgary. It's so good to be back home. There's so many people, familiar faces out there. I'm really happy to be home. So thank you to University of Calgary for inviting me to this event. Honored to be after Douglas Cardinal, who there are very few mentors in this profession. So to be sitting here up on stage, or standing on stage after Douglas Cardinal, it's completely mysterious to me, but thank you. I'm honored to be following you on stage. I also want to acknowledge our territory, Treaty 7, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, Tsuut'ina Nation, and Stoney Nakoda Nation, who I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of the communities within Alberta. I am from Saddle Lake First Nation, so this is home to me. I live in Phoenix now, so very nice to be home. I just want to take a second. So today, my talk is directed toward Native students, trying to bring more of our community members into this profession, because as you got from listening to Douglas Cardinal, it really connects us. It coalesces so many things that are so vital to our culture, that it's just a wonderful profession to be involved in, because you're really back home, you're on the res, you're talking to the communities, you're listening, you're hearing the voices, you're trying to understand, you're learning, and it's just, you would be your education would not be lost by coming to school, to our architecture school. So just a minute about my title. The Institute Professor is a new position that was created at Arizona State University. I'm one of 5 at ASU. And it's 5 creative professionals, so we have someone from dance, theater, music, architecture, and urban planning. A lot of us have built a social practice, kind of working with community, a community-minded practice. And they've brought us in there to inspire ASU and to work with ASU, all of the disciplines, so creative and non-creative, to try and grow the community nature practice of what we've been doing outside of academia. So I had to bring in, sorry about the fuzzy picture, but I had to bring a picture of home. I had to provide the context of where the beginning of my lived experience begins. So this is Saddle Lake First Nation. My kukum is up in the top row in the middle. I'm the one in the coral colored jacket below. These are most of my cousins, not all. And this is where we spent a lot of time. So my mom was the only one out of 6 siblings that moved off the res. So all of our family was still on the res, so every Christmas, every holiday, every summer holiday, we spent back home. So very connected, and for me, it was much more fun to be out there riding horses and climbing around hay bales than anything I could have gotten up to in the city. So absolute joy to be part of this place. So where I am now, this is an arrow pointing to Arizona, and the map that I'm showing, all of the colored portions on that map are tribal land in America. So the arrow points to Arizona, and we're home to 22 tribes, so it's a very dense, as you can see from the map, it's a really dense location to be practicing in. There is a very strong, similar to Alberta, there's a very strong Indigenous tradition within the place that I am practicing and teaching. So we are home of Navajo Nation, is the largest color on the map, Hopi, Gila River, Peeposh, Pima, Odham, so 22 tribes inhabit that area. And whenever I go to speak to another place, I try and understand at least a little bit of where I sit from, Calgary. I was looking at Calgary and I was looking at Phoenix, and we really are sister cities. So when I look at the Indigenous populations, from Calgary to Phoenix, very similar. I look at how many Indigenous students we have. We have a bit more at Phoenix just because I think we are in the middle of Navajo territory and we have a large population of Navajos down south. We also lack Indigenous faculty, which I think I'm working hard to try and push a lot of our Indigenous kids through their PhDs and to come back and teach. So I was at a talk last week with the President Crow of Arizona State University, and he always reminds people that he didn't come from a family tradition of university-educated people. He's now the president of the largest university in the United States. We have like 100,000 students attending ASU, and he didn't have any mentors or examples that were educated. And I would echo the same sentiments that no one in my extended family went to university. It was a really odd place to be, and if not, and there's many familiar faces from our U of A days back in the Native Student Center that kept us, I guess, situated and connected to this institution that is a university. Shauna Cunningham, Cora Voyager, I see a few familiar faces, Brian Callahoo, that without that support system, the university is a very foreign place. So I think what led me into staying to university was that Native Student Center at U of A. But what started this journey of design education, I worked at Canadian Tire as a cashier, and I remember hearing two girls talking about going backpacking to Australia on a trip. And I wanted to go backpacking to Australia, but of course no one from the little neighborhood I grew up in West Jasper Place, middle class, working class, blue collar neighborhood in West Jasper Place, nobody went backpacking to Australia, but I listened to those girls closely. I followed what they were doing. I bought the Lonely Plant guides, and I took off on a journey that started in Australia, but ended up lasting 7 years, and I hit something like 40 countries. And I think that's where I didn't learn from books, but I learned this sort of lived experience that I needed to go and see all of the great buildings of the world, and to walk around the cities and to see what was created, what came before. But I think what inspired me during my trip was not so much the big architectures of the Taj Mahal, but it was more so looking at the cultures that lived within the spaces I was visiting. So these are what I call master builders. This is Indonesia. These spaces of lived experience, which I equated with my experience of living within Saddle Lake's, within the nation of Saddle Lake that had its culture, it had its language, it had its people, it had its lifeways, it has a worldview. These were the spaces that really interested me. This is Angkor Wat in Cambodia, one of my favorite structures in the world. So when I came back, or when I was wanting to come back to America after, 7 or 8 years traveling, I sent my portfolio to EVDS, to the design school, and they probably, I'm not sure if they've seen a portfolio that was so random. Instead of typical architectural drawings, I had quill work, I had beadwork, there were jingles in there, it was acoustic, I had drawings of elders' faces, so it was a very unusual portfolio, I think. So I'm glad, thank you for not ignoring the portfolio that was really my lived experience encapsulated in this package. So I was lucky when I finished that Master's of Architecture degree. I was really, really fortunate there were only 7 Native architects at the time when I graduated, and I was so blessed to end up working for Alfred Waugh, who is he's Chippewan, he lives in Vancouver, his practice is called Formline, and he's just a superb individual with an incredibly culturally grounded practice. So I worked for him for 3 or 4 years. We worked together, which was really formative. Highly recommend to those young students when you graduate, try and get a job in one of the Native firms to understand that philosophy. If you can work in as many Native firms as possible, I think it would be a phenomenal opportunity. I ended up, after the experience with Alfred, I ended up working at a firm here in town, Zeidler Partnership Architects. I knew a big building was coming. I was interested in big building. I thought it would be very interesting. In the end, it wasn't that interesting. It's really monotonous. 5 years of my life went into this. But what carried me through was at EVDS, I learned a lot of 3D modeling skills. I was fascinated by being able to create space in 3D, and I loved it from our days in Form Z for all my fellow graduates who remember old school 3D modeling programs. So I became the Revit. I was an early adopter in Revit, the 3D technology. So I ended up becoming the Revit go-to. We did that building in Revit, would you believe? 2 offices, 500 people, 1 massive Revit model, and I was stuck doing all of the really complex curves in that building. So after that, I needed to change back into spaces that were more tuned to people, culture, the way they live, get back to what my original intentions were, which was working with culture and community, the lives, the worldviews. So these are some projects that I did since around 2010. I have a small practice and I work with other architecture firms, but I also do a few projects on my own, Indigenous law office, a house, a lot of projects with our tribal communities in this state, in this province. But then somewhere within about 2010, I decided that I was getting asked to do a lot of master planning, and of course architects do this all the time. We get involved in really large planning. Even though we're not trained as planners, I thought I better go and get some training in planning because I'm doing all of these master plans with our tribal communities. So I went and did a city design degree in Syracuse in California, which was a great place to study, great city to live in. And while I was there, it has a very progressive design, as there's a lot of influence internationally, a lot of big architecture personalities come through here. I'm not sure I saw myself within this school. I think there was a certain skill set that came out of this, but I'm not sure I was really identifying with a lot of the stuff that they were teaching. They weren't really interested in exploring indigeneity. You know, at U of C, I see my professors out there, and we were always having discussions about how to make indigeneity, to bring it into the work we're doing. And there, they weren't as interested. Still a phenomenal experience. But one of the, I think, key projects in the last 5 years was a project that I did here in Calgary. It was that Early Learning Center, Calgary Board of Education. And I did it with Beck Vale, who formerly did the Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, but they hadn't done any tribal work in, I don't know, 20 years or so. And so they were a little out of practice on engagement and the community consultation process. So I led them through that along with Calgary Board of Education because they thought I could just pick up a pen, design the space, and I said, no, we're going to have these big sessions, we're going to talk to people, and I had a lot of one-on-ones with many people that are in this room, a lot of big community sessions to get to a school which was all about a traditional way of teaching and learning for our little ones, which was really profound. And I think this was one of the experiences that has really changed my career because I realized that we need to teach this. Somebody needs to go to schools and tell our kids why we do what we do, what the process of a design looks like, why do we take all the steps that we do in design. So this phase of my career is really about teaching. And it's about really making visible all of the invisible, what has been invisible for so long, the stories, the voice, the lived experience, but also creating mechanisms within the university, and I commend the University of Calgary. I've been flipping through the Indigenous strategy. It's phenomenal, and I'm taking it straight to my leadership as soon as I get back to ASU. So thank you for that. But I think it's a great mechanism for doing work in a good way. And so I'm focused on building mechanisms within this, the work. And I think ever so critical now for many of us that are in this field and are building these mechanisms for things to be done in a good way. I think it's really timely. You know, many of us working on the Venice Biennale together, a lot of the, almost all of the Indigenous architects in Canada. And we're talking through a lot of issues of identity and indigeneity. And I think there's many examples that have come out in the last like 2, 3, 4 years that are scary and that really do keep me up at night. This is one of them. This is Fashion Week 2015. On the left is a Navajo sacred deity pattern on a black leather evening gown. On the far right, that's a family-held pattern held by Bethany Yellowtail. And it ended up on New York Fashion Week. This is another example that keeps me up at night. This is in Australia. I'm not sure if any of you know this building, but this is a face of a 19th century Indigenous activist and leader, an artist and an activist. And a real estate company used his image and put it on the outside of a building. And the Indigenous people in Australia are calling it a cruel juxtaposition. And of course, this example that many of you know, it has a reference for us to burial grounds. Would there have been a mechanism that we could have put in place that the outcome would have been different? So, the last part of this, I just wanted to share some of the, and I call it recentering work at ASU because I think we often think of the university as centers, but I think for me, and I'm probably for many of us in the audience, there are other centers, and so I'm trying to recenter. This is the way I think about Indigenous architecture, as a process of recentering. So I recentered my work a lot in the field. This is up in the Navajo Nation. I teach an interdisciplinary studio, which is a crazy being to teach because we have like American Indian Studies with social sciences, with architecture planning, and we do design and planning work for tribal communities, which is really cool, but to get that many people to think in the same realm can be very challenging, but we do have a lot of fun road trips. We're also focused on making. So the tradition with the climate in Phoenix, for those of you who haven't been in July, 47 degrees I think was our high last summer. There were other ways of living in that extreme climate. Adobe was one of them. So we're working with one of the tribes. We did an Adobe block making demonstration, but now we're building a shade structure. Shade is critical in Phoenix, and of course they have a lot of traditions built around shade and built around these very thick Adobe walls, so we're working with them to build. And I work with, we're starting work with a number of master builders, which are the builders from within our tribal communities. And the basis of the work, the recentering I do, is based a lot on reciprocity. So if the project, I won't get involved in a project unless there is value to the community I'm working with. I won't do research for research sake. I will always make sure that somehow we're benefiting the community that we're working with. And this is a woman we've been working with in a remote community in Tulani Lake, Navajo Nation. She's 90 some odd. She lives in a hogan without running water. So is there a solution for remote construction, affordable construction? So I'm also recentering the CRIT, tradition in architecture. We bring practitioners from outside and we have them critique the work. It's part of their architecture school. It can be really fun, it can be really scary. But my critiques, I invite tribes in and I invite them to give constructive feedback and hang out and chat with our students in our class. I think it's a really nice end to the year. And then the other recentering we're doing, we've been tasked by the president. I'm working with a group of Native students that we're trying to indigenize the campus. What would that look like if we were to create either a building or take over a vertical surface or create furniture or signage or wayfinding language? What would it look like if we were recentering ASU as a campus? And I brought a couple of my individual research interests. So I'm really interested in language. So I'm starting to define, trying to look at architecture through my language, but through other languages. And going back to the meanings of design, construction, build. What does it mean and what did those mean? And can that influence the visual language by understanding a spoken language? I'm also looking at photovoice, where you give the camera to the community and you try and understand the community through the eyes of the people that we are working for. And then I think only after that will I may be able to kind of re-aggregate all of that information. This is a crazy diagram by Chris Cornelius. He's an Oneida architect, but I think it really begins to describe that holistic, all of the factors that go into producing Indigenous architecture. In there is sun, moon, wind, landscape, harvesting. There's all these concepts, and I think we need to begin to aggregate this into a system where we can share and make visible those systems. And then finally, I think from that point, I think I may have a better understanding to begin to think about architecture, to think about how I would measure the success of Indigenous architecture in an academic institution. So with that, I think that's all I brought. I just wanted to leave what I'm thinking these days of Indigenous architecture as, which is story, it is the voice, and it is our lived experience of the people that live in our communities. Thank you.